Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a major escalation in the war in Iran, which potentially takes this conflict in a completely different direction, because the United States has effectively declared economic war on Iran. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has described what is now happening as economic D-Day, an economic onslaught, and what he says will become the world's biggest financial offensive ever launched against an adversary. And Donald Trump has described it as the most crushing economic operation ever taken against a country. But this isn't simply another round of sanctions against a few Iranian companies. The United States is now threatening the rest of the world. The basic message is very simple. If you continue doing business with Iran, then you could potentially lose access to the United States and, more importantly, the dollar-based global financial system. And that creates an absolutely enormous problem, because if you're genuinely going to isolate Iran from the global economy, there's one country that you will have to confront: China. China is Iran's biggest oil customer, and that means that what is currently being presented as an economic war against Iran could potentially turn into another major confrontation between the two biggest economies in the world. At the same time, Iran is not sitting quietly and accepting any of this. Iranian officials are now talking about devastating responses, attacks against US interests and energy choke points, and have even been threats that not one drop of oil will leave the Persian Gulf if this economic war continues. So in this video, we're going to look at exactly what the United States has announced, who's actually being targeted, why China is absolutely critical, what Iran could potentially do in response, and what all of this means for oil prices, inflation, global trade, and the world economy. And perhaps most importantly, how does any of this actually end? Because right now, neither side appears to be prepared to back down. Now, before we get into all of those details, could I ask you to subscribe if you haven't already hit that subscriber button? It really does help me with the algorithm. You could also give me a thumbs up for this video, and if you can see that funny little hype symbol alongside the thumbs up, then if you can hit that, then it will help promote this video to more people, so that would be fantastic. So let's start by talking about what's actually been announced. The Trump administration has been talking for several days about taking economic pressure on Iran to an entirely different level. Scott Bessent described the beginning of a campaign as an economic D-Day. The objective is what the United States described as essentially the total financial isolation of Iran. And the first package has now been unveiled. Around 60 individuals, companies and vessels have been targeted. But actually, that isn't the most interesting part, because America has also widened the activities that could expose foreign companies and financial institutions to what are known as secondary sanctions. If you've been following all of the videos I've made on Russia, you'll be familiar with that concept of secondary sanctions. And those now include 5 particularly important areas: digital assets, gold, technology, aviation, and shipping. So the objective here isn't simply to stop Iran selling oil, it's to make it increasingly difficult for Iran to move money, receive payments, transport goods, obtain technology, use cryptocurrencies, move gold and precious metals, access aircraft and aviation services, or use the international shipping system. In other words, Washington is trying to attack the plumbing that connects Iran to the global economy. And that's where secondary sanctions become incredibly important, because there are broadly 2 different types of sanctions we're talking about. The first is relatively straightforward. America says that American companies can't deal with particular Iranian businesses. But secondary sanctions go much further. America can effectively say to a company in another country, you have a choice. You can do business with Iran, or you can do business with us, but potentially you can't do both. And when you consider the importance of the US dollar, American banks, and access to the American financial markets, that's an incredibly powerful threat. And Scott Bessent has effectively put foreign banks and companies on notice. Countries are being given an opportunity to sever their links with Iran. But after that, America is threatening consequences. Interestingly, the United States hasn't immediately pressed the nuclear button economically. When Bessent was asked why the most severe secondary sanctions hadn't simply been imposed immediately, his response was revealing. He basically asked, why would we want to blow up the global financial system? And that gets us to China, because if America really means what it's saying, eventually it will have to deal with China. China has been Iran's biggest oil customer for years. In 2025, it bought around 1.4 million barrels of Iranian oil every single day. Iran has created a sophisticated system involving independent Chinese refiners, middlemen, ships, obscure companies, payments outside the dollar system, and oil that can sometimes be relabeled as originating elsewhere. And despite years of American sanctions, that system has continued operating. Now, the war and the American blockade have already had a major impact. Iranian oil flows to China have fallen dramatically, but they haven't stopped. And so Bessent was asked directly about Chinese banks. His answer was that nobody is above the reach of American sanctions. Now that's an extraordinary statement, because sanctioning a small company buying Iranian oil is one thing. Sanctioning a major Chinese financial institution is something completely different. That could potentially prevent that bank from clearing dollar transactions. It could restrict access to America's financial system, and it could trigger retaliation from Beijing. China could respond economically. It could impose restrictions on American companies. It could escalate to a trade war. And one of the biggest potential weapons China possesses is its control over the supply and processing of critical minerals and rare earths that America desperately needs. So this is a potentially dangerous game of economic chicken. The United States is effectively saying, stop financing Iran. China is saying that it doesn't recognize America's unilateral sanctions and will protect its legitimate interests. And at some point, somebody may have to actually decide whether those threats are real. China isn't the only country involved here. Turkey continues to trade billions of dollars worth of goods with Iran. Iraq has historically bought large quantities of Iranian gas. India still sells food, pharmaceuticals, and other humanitarian goods into Iran. Pakistan has been looking to increase bilateral trade. Russia has obviously developed strategic relations with Tehran, and historically, one of Iran's most important economic gateways has been the United Arab Emirates. Dubai, in particular, has played an important role in Iranian trade and payments, but that route has now become considerably more difficult because the UAE has suspended trade and financial sanction transactions with Iran. So when you put all of this together, the economic pressure is becoming very substantial. And we've already seen that in Iran itself. The Iranian rial has fallen to record lows. Inflation is extremely high. The economy has been badly damaged by 6 months of war. Oil exports have fallen sharply, and the government is finding it increasingly difficult to access foreign currency. So America is effectively betting that if it keeps tightening the screws, eventually the pressure will become unbearable for Iran. But there is a major problem with that strategy. Iran gets a vote as well, and its response has been extremely aggressive. The head of Iran's armed forces has promised crushing, punishing, and devastating responses. Iran's economy minister has said that Iran is prepared for America's economic attack and made a particularly interesting comment. He said Iran's defense is no longer so defensive, and he warned Iran's enemies to wait for an attack. The Revolutionary Guard has also threatened attacks against American vital interests and energy choke points if Iranian infrastructure is threatened. Now, we obviously don't know exactly what Iran intends to do, but there are several possibilities here. The most obvious is the Strait of Hormuz. Before this war, around 1/5 or 20% of the world's crude oil and LNG was flowing through that narrow stretch of water, but traffic has now collapsed, and Iran has demonstrated repeatedly that even without having the conventional military strength of the United States, it can make commercial shipping through this area extremely dangerous. Iran has now identified dozens of tankers which it claims have breached its navigation rules and have threatened action against them, potentially including confiscating cargoes. There's also been the extraordinary warning that if America's economic war continues, not one drop of oil will leave the Persian Gulf. Now, whether Iran could actually enforce that completely is another question, but it doesn't actually have to. This is one of the asymmetric aspects of this war that we've discussed before. Iran doesn't have to sink every single tanker. It doesn't have to completely close the Strait of Hormuz. It simply has to make the risk sufficiently high that ship owners don't want to go there, insurers won't insure the vessels, or insurance premiums become prohibitively expensive, and suddenly the economic impact becomes enormous. Iran could potentially also increase attacks against energy infrastructure across the Gulf. oil fields, refineries, export terminals, pipelines, ports, desalination plants, power infrastructure. Any significant attack on those assets could immediately change the calculation in global energy markets. And then there's the Red Sea. Iran has relationships with regional armed groups, most importantly the Houthis in Yemen, and shipping through the Red Sea and towards the Suez Canal has already been targeted during this conflict. So one possible Iranian response would be to increase pressure on multiple global shipping routes simultaneously. Strait of Hormuz in the east, the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandab in the west. That would leave shipping companies facing disruption to two of the world's most important maritime trade arteries. And that matters far beyond oil, because if ships have to divert around Africa, journeys become longer, fuel costs rise, as do freight rates and insurance costs, container availability will become tighter, goods will take longer to reach customers, and ultimately somebody has to pay for all of that, and that somebody is usually you and me, the consumer. Which brings us back to inflation. Oil is currently sitting at around the $90 per barrel level. That's still extremely expensive compared with where we were at the start of this year when it was sitting at 60. But what's fascinating is that following the announcement of the economic D-Day, oil prices actually fell. The market's reaction has been surprisingly relaxed. And there is a reason for that. Investors appear to be saying that economic sanctions are preferable to bombs and missiles. If America is moving away from direct military escalation and towards financial pressure, then perhaps the immediate risk to physical oil infrastructure is lower, and therefore oil doesn't need to price in quite as much geopolitical risk. But I think there's an enormous assumption built into that Iran is not going to respond. Because if Iran decides that America's economic attack is an act of war and responds by hitting Gulf energy infrastructure or tightening its grip on the Strait of Hormuz, then this becomes a completely different ballgame. Oil prices could rise sharply, petrol and gasoline prices will go higher, as will airline costs, transport costs, manufacturing costs, and inflation globally will start rising. Central banks will therefore have less room to cut interest rates, bond yields will come under pressure, consumers will have less disposable income, and global economic growth will weaken. This is how a regional war turns into an economic problem for someone sitting thousands of miles away who has absolutely nothing to do with Iran. So where does all of this go? Well, that's the difficult question. The US strategy appears to be that Iran's economy breaks before America loses patience. Iran's strategy appears to be the opposite of that. Make the economic cost of the war sufficiently painful for America and its allies that Washington eventually agrees to a deal. And both sides believe that time is on their side. The United States believes Iran is economically exhausted. Iran believes higher oil prices and disruption to global trade create political problems for Donald Trump, particularly with American voters extremely sensitive to gasoline prices and inflation. Meanwhile, negotiations continue through countries including Pakistan and Oman. And ultimately, I suspect negotiation is still the only realistic way this ends. The United States could intensify the military campaign dramatically, but that risks an even bigger regional war. Iran could escalate dramatically itself, but it risks inviting overwhelming retaliation. America can impose even more severe sanctions, but eventually it will bring China into the plan. And Iran can disrupt the Strait of Hormuz further, but doing that damages countries whose support or neutrality Tehran desperately needs. Which means we're reaching an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Both sides realistically need a deal, but neither side wants to look like it needs a deal. And that's why this new economic phase is so important, because America's economic D-Day isn't really just about Iran. It's about whether the United States can force the rest of the world to choose Iran or the dollar system. And if China refuses to make that choice, Washington will have to decide whether it's actually prepared to follow through on its threat. That could turn an economic war against Iran into something considerably bigger. And if Iran follows through on its threats against energy infrastructure and shipping, the consequences won't remain in the Middle East. They will be felt through oil prices, inflation, interest rates, supply chains, and ultimately economic growth around the world. And remarkably, right now, the markets are all very relaxed about this. But the big question is, are they right? Or are we going to discover that economic D-Day was just the beginning of the problems for the global economy? So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, most importantly thought-provoking, and trying to get you thinking in different ways. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you have the option of hitting that hype symbol, please do that. It would really help this video. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end. Really appreciate that. And also appreciate your support in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that generosity. Thank you. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, that long-term support is really the main reason why I'm still here on YouTube. So thank you so much for that support. Really do appreciate it. And I'll see you again next time.